No, by Lady Arsenic. I was 8 years old in the summer of 1999, and as soon as school let out, I found myself at my best friend Matthew's house every day of the week. His parents would spend weekends at work, and my big sister got paid to babysit him until they came home. Since we were best friends, and there was one to watch me, I tagged along. When the weekends came, I would sleep over if I begged hard enough, and we'd spend the whole day and night playing Pokémon. By then, Pokémon was still a new monstrous craze sweeping the neighborhood, and we were completely caught up in the hype. He had red, I had blue, and with our trusty link cable, we were determined to catch 'em all before the next school year started. However, of course, Pokémon is a relatively short game, and at the rate we were going, it was all over in a month. The Elite Four were obliterated, Mewtwo was vanquished in the Cerulean Cave, and several of the Pokémon were caught or traded. The game gets boring after the Indigo League gets taken down, and we felt like we had no direction after that. Matthew was the first to find out about the infamous Missing No rumor, and was excited to tell me the news. Pokémon had been the first video game I was truly dedicated to, and I didn't understand what glitches were, so I didn't believe a thing he said. Matthew always hated it when I called him a liar, so he shoved Pokémon Red into his Super Game Boy to show me on the television screen and went through the routine. I watched skeptically as he talked to the old man in Viridian City and flew off to Cinnabar Island, and I was getting ready to gloat about what an idiot he was when it inevitably wouldn't work. When the pixelated mess that was Missing No showed up, however, my smugness turned into shock. The level was some obscene number and the health gauge stretched from one side of the television screen to the other. Matthew basked in the glory of being right, as he tactfully said, "I told you so," and shut the game off. "What even was that?" I asked as we got back to our games. "No idea. I just know that you're not supposed to catch it, or they'll mess up your game," he replied. When I gestured for him to elaborate, he simply shrugged. "Have you caught one?" I demanded. "No, stupid, I just said you're not supposed to." I muttered that I wasn't stupid and went back to playing, but the suspicion was getting to me. I was a gullible kid, and Matthew knew it. Once he had convinced me that there was a dead body in the woods, but a mile outside of his house. After half an hour of walking, I wound up in somebody's unfenced yard and got chased back to his house by their angry dogs. Did he just tell me not to catch Missing No because he only wanted one for himself? Was I just missing out on something wonderful and falling for another one of his mean tricks? I huffed, deciding that when I get home, I'd see for myself. When I was finally home in my cozy basement, I curled up on my old couch, my blue cartridge nestled in the back of my enormous classic Game Boy. Remembering how Matthew had done it, I spoke to the old man in Viridian City and carefully coasted along the eastern coast of Cinnabar Island. The random encounter music began, and for some reason I felt a flutter of nervousness. The Pokémon was just a mess of static blocks meshed together, the name above the impossibly large health gauge, reading, Missing No. The cry sounded garbled and I couldn't identify it, but it reminded me somewhat of the sound a Zubat made. It immediately took out my level 70 Blastoise with a Hydro Pump, and I instantly started to panic. Blastoise was the strongest thing in my party. Without really thinking, I hurled the Master Ball at it, and had a sudden lurking suspicion that maybe even that couldn't handle this thing. However, it shook 4 times and then lay still. I did it. I caught the Missing No. I thought about calling Matthew and bragging about it, but that same flicker of nervousness came back. What if he had been right? What if my game would stop working after this? Chewing on my bottom lip, I checked out Missing No's summary. On the screen, displaying my party, its sprite was the old man NPC from Viridian City. There was no cry when the profile came up, and there was the same disarray of shapes that it had been when I first saw that one in Matthew's room. It was a baffling level 127, and all the stats are strangely displayed as NA. It knew 4 moves: Hydro Pump, Hydro Pump, Hydro Pump, and Fly. I wasn't sure what to think of it. It was the most bizarre thing I'd ever come across in Pokémon, or any other game really. However, I gave it some thought and decided to do what any self-respecting 8-year-old would do with a Pokémon like this: go on a power trip. Missing No was a tornado of destruction, one-shotting any poor Pokémon that crossed its path. I took it to the Elite Four and started sweeping through them with ease. When I started the fight with Agatha, I summoned it as usual. The text box said, "Get 'em, no?" There was space where the rest of the name should have been, but where'd it go? This was a weird Pokemon, so I didn't think anything of it and continued. By the time I got to Lance, I got bored of Missing No, or just No now I guess. The game was too easy now and more dull than ever, so I decided to switch Pokemon and fight him fairly, going to get out my good old Blastoise. "Can't escape," the text box said, and the match continued with no in the front. What? I dismayed, trying to summon Blastoise again when the turn was over. It kept happening. No matter how many times I tried to summon my other Pokemon, the "can't escape" text box would appear. Begrudgingly, I finished the fight with Lance using no, and opened my start screen to move one of my other Pokemon in the front when it was over. All of my Pokemon were named No now. Their sprites in the roster changed to the Old Man NPC. Worried, I checked all of their summaries. The close-up sprites were jumbled now, but still recognizable. Their stats were all set to NA, but their move lists were still correct. I tried to switch Blastoise to the front line, and got that new text box. Oak. Blue. Now is not the time to use that. Confused, I tried again and got the same message. The same thing happened when I tried the rest of my Pokemon. I saved and switched off the game, hoping a reset would sort everything out. Was I ever wrong? The music at the title screen was all kinds of screwed up, barely recognizable from what it used to be. The animations were sort of right, but everything looked corrupted and mangled. I soldiered through it and loaded my game, immediately checking my Pokemon team. They were gone. All of them were gone except for No. I started to panic, blindly clicking on the empty spaces and growing more discouraged every time nothing happened. Eventually I checked No's summary just to see what else could have changed. The sprite was the same, but the stats had changed from NA to just No. It was now some ridiculous level, far over 300, and its move list was just No in all 4 slots. When I exited the display and start screen, the familiar Indigo League music flatlined to one ongoing 8-bit note. There was a solid brick of dread in my stomach, and I decided to just move on to Gary's chamber. Maybe beating the Elite Four would fix everything? When I moved, my character's sprite stayed facing north no matter which direction I'd make him go. If the rest of what was going on hadn't been so worrying, I'd have thought it was funny. But all it did was unsettle me farther. The single ongoing note continued as I entered Gary's room. And when I pressed A next to him, his dialogue had changed into nothing but mashed up jumbled characters. When we entered battle mode, the song was just a blather of noise and confusion, and a great deal of Gary's sprite was just gone altogether. I used No, having no other choice. Whenever it was my turn, a text box would just say No, and Gary's Pokemon would get wiped out in one sweep. It was over in 6 turns. Gary reappeared at the end of the match as usual, but all he had to say was No. The screen faded out to white, staying that way for a long time with that endless grating chiptune note playing. At first I thought maybe this was it for my game. As soon as I began to get upset and want to turn the game off, Professor Oak's sprite appeared. It was the one you see when you first start a new game, but most of the shading was gone. He was entirely white, transparent against the black wall behind him. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, and a quick text box flashed up before the game crashed altogether. No. By the end of the summer, I had finally told Matthew about the incident. We had stopped playing Pokemon for a month or so, and we were just doing normal kid stuff now. He called me a chicken shit and laughed at me for being afraid of what happened, and I admit that he was right for telling me not to catch a missing No. He suggested that I just start a new game and everything would go back to normal. I considered it, but ultimately forgot about it when school started up again. It wasn't until Christmas break when I remembered my Pokemon Blue. Commercials for Pokemon Yellow were running at the time, and I was excited about the possibility of getting one over the holidays. I popped in my Blue cartridge, hoping that it would tide me over until I get to see what the new release is like. The glitchy music and animations began, and everything I'd forgotten was now thrust in my face all over again. Deciding to follow Matthew's advice and start fresh, I clicked on New Game. No. Nervously, I reset. Of course it didn't work. I took out the cartridge, blew on it, said a small prayer, and tried again. No. Gritting my teeth, I loaded the game, which thankfully brought me back to Lance's chamber. Blue was still there doing that weird north-facing crab walk, but I got the hell out of Dodge and hurried back to Viridian City. If I couldn't start from a new game, I was going to get rid of No once and for all. Arriving at the Pokemon Center, I marched, or crab walked, straight to the computer, booting up Bill's storage system, and tried depositing No. The familiar No text box appeared, then another, then another. Soon my screen was flooded with them. The cheerful Pokemon Center music was now a roar of jumbled 8-bit sounds as more and more No text boxes filled the screen. I immediately flicked the switch off on my Game Boy, but they wouldn't go away. The flooding text boxes accompanied the deranged music seemed to be screaming at me. Frightened, I ripped the cartridge and the batteries out of my Game Boy and threw it across the room. It was finally quiet again, and I let out a sigh of relief. Christmas came and went, and I didn't get Pokémon Yellow until I raked up enough money for my extended family to go buy it myself. It was fun and familiar, Pikachu was adorable, and nothing ever told me no again. When the following summer my old Pokémon Blue cartridge had somehow wound up in Matthew's swimming pool filter, it had also possibly been smashed by my mother's hammer from the tool drawer. When asked if I cared, I smiled to myself and happily replied, no. That was no. Final thoughts? I'm mixed. I like the idea, it doesn't go too far for the most part, however I think it could have been handled better. It's refreshing to see a classic story of someone who is just playing a game and it gets glitched. People on my forum nowadays are just mostly writing stories from the perspective of someone in the game, and it's almost always disappointing. If you want to relate to the audience, the best way to do it is by having the story be from the perspective of somebody playing the game, not in it. I think the repetition of no throughout the story might have gone a bit far. By a point, it just becomes less creepy and more comical. As its believability starts to wear, it becomes harder to take seriously. Where exactly the point is in the story depends on the person reading it mostly, but I'd say by the time it starts to affect things outside of battle, is around when it's getting a bit too unbelievable. I get that the author might have felt the need to up the ante for the climax, and that's why the Game Boy wouldn't turn off when the powers flicked off, but this majorly hurts the suspension of disbelief, as at that point, the video game affects real life. The power switch on a classic Game Boy is an actual mechanical switch. It will always turn the Game Boy off. A game can't possibly stop the system from turning off with a power switch. It just stretches the suspension of disbelief too far for that moment, and would have been better without that one line. Also, having a happy ending kind of ruins the end of the story. It doesn't need to end on the thing coming back in some way or some sort of twist. In fact, those often ruin stories. Just have it end with remembering what happened, and that's good enough. It's like finishing your meal with a tea when you want to keep the sweet flavor of dessert. The tea just sucks out the sweetness. In this case, a happy, jokey ending just takes out the lingering creepiness that some people might have had with the story. Overall, I felt like it was a good story, but it had a lot of room for improvement. That's it for this creepypasta. Tune in again next Saturday when we tackle yet another story made and sent in by the fans without Brief Candle. If you want to write your own story, help peer edit a story, or even just read the stories early, check out the description where you'll find a link to the creepypasta section of my forum. You'll also find a link to the playlist of every creepypasta reading I've done. If you're interested in keeping up on my blog posts, join the Facebook fan page linked below, and if you want to support me and what I do, check out the Patreon page in the description. Remember that if you want your story to be read on the show, you must stay active on your post on the forum, as well as read the forum rules. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.